A reading from Exodus. First from chapter 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, and then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night, and they shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." And from chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever it is, first to open the womb among the Israelites, of human beings and animals, is mine." Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Abib, you are going out. When the Lord brings you into the land of Canaan, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your child on that day, 'It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt.'" The word of the Lord. The Passover is arguably the most important story of the Jewish people. It is the story that tells them who they are, whose they are, who God is, and what God wants for God's people. But it kind of actually begins back in Genesis with the stories that we've already looked at through the month of September. It begins with God's promise to Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob. The promise of them being the fathers of nations. Last week, we finished out the book of Genesis with Joseph welcoming his father and brothers to Egypt. The whole of Jacob's family settles in Egypt and grows very large. Not all that unexpectedly when you have a dozen sons, and then they all have a whole bunch of kids, and then all of them have a bunch of kids. So the house of Israel, Jacob's family, grows and thrives in Egypt. that is, until the Pharaoh who loves Joseph so much dies. The new Pharaoh, who has no relationship with or love for Joseph, only sees these Hebrew people, this very large group of people who are strong and able, as a threat. And he says, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, they will join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." And suddenly, the Israelite people in Egypt find themselves slaves, an oppressed people. And this Pharaoh, who is a violent oppressor, holds them in slavery. And the more he feels his power threatened, the more his brutality increases. We are told that Pharaoh orders the firstborn boys of the slaves to be killed, which is how Moses finds himself in a basket made out of reeds, floating down the Nile. When the population of slaves continues to grow in number and strength, Pharaoh increases the daily quota of brick production and announces that they must also go and gather the straw for the bricks themselves, without any decrease in production. Pharaoh's cruelty, it appears, knows no bounds. But then the story tells us that God hears the groaning and the cries of these oppressed and hopeless people. That God remembers the covenant God made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That God sets into motion events that lead to salvation, freedom for all those who are enslaved. And thus, the Passover text of today and the ensuing Exodus events with Moses, they are some of the most defining events of God's relationship with God's people. In truth, it's probably more accurate to call this the defining moment in the relationship between God and Israel. In the Passover and Exodus, God is revealed as the God of deliverance. God liberates people from oppression. This is the saving God who calls people to live in freedom. On the night of the Passover, the sacrificed lamb became a sign of freedom from slavery for the whole people of Israel. So when the Jewish people retell this story year after year, they remember they were to mark their homes with the blood from the lamb. And as the Lord passed through Egypt, striking down the firstborn in each home and barn, the blood on the door was a sign to pass over that home, sparing its family from death and destruction and more grief. Every year at Passover, our Jewish siblings gather to share in the Seder meal, their own ritual of remembrance. And part of that ritual is for them to retell the story, just as they are instructed in the second part of our reading today. They remember that a loud cry went up in Egypt that night, because not one household was left untouched, except for the homes marked as God had said. The Pharaoh had made it through all the plagues, rivers of blood, frogs, lice, wild animals, pestilence, boils, fiery hail, locusts, and darkness. All those he could endure. But when it was his own firstborn struck down, he had had enough. And so he sends the Israelites away. Go away from my people. Take your flocks and your herds and be gone. I think it's important for us to pause for a brief moment to acknowledge that freedom for the Israelites came at a significant cost. Who knows how many Egyptian parents wailed that night? And while we want to just gloss over that part, I think it's important to note that some things in our scriptures are hard to deal with. Some don't make sense. The God who chose freedom for the oppressed is the same God who seemingly murdered thousands on the same night. What do we do with this? If these are the great moments that we're commanded to recall for our children and our children's children, how do we explain such a seemingly hypocritical God? What story do we tell our little ones? First, I think we acknowledge that we don't have perfect answers. And sometimes we have no answers at all. And then I think we tell them the story of God's justice, of how God created enough for everyone, and that God's laws would allow for everyone to live in peaceful and equitable community if we were better at following God's rules. We can tell them that each of us has a calling to partner with God and participate in the work of justice. We can tell our children that the good news is always sweetest to those who are oppressed and those who suffer, because God is always working to free the oppressed, and God is always present to those who suffer. The Pharaoh and the Egyptians, they too had a chance to participate in a different kind of justice, like that which existed under Joseph's Pharaoh, the one who offered good land to an alien family in a time of trouble. But this Pharaoh and the Egyptians were caught up in themselves, in getting and keeping and having more. It turns out God's radical plan for justice and human desire and greed exist within one story. And that isn't new. We saw this in the stories of Genesis 2, all the way back to the garden. We saw then with Jacob and Esau, and then with all of Jacob's sons. God has a dream and a promise, and then people make choices with only themselves in mind and not God's dream. So like all these characters that we are reading about, we likely will not see the fulfillment of the kingdom in our lifetime. But we are called, through the telling of the stories of our faith, to remember, and then to make different choices, to choose to participate in bringing about God's kingdom. We are called to make decisions not out of greed or selfishness, but out of love of neighbor. And so we tell the story. The same story that God delivers those who suffer from oppression, that God works for the flourishing of the world. that God freed the Israelites from 400 years of slavery and led them to the promised land. And the story of Jesus, who kissed lepers, ate with all the wrong people, baffled the authorities, broke bread with the disciples, was crucified, died, and rose again to new life. In telling the story of God's saving and redemptive activity throughout a long history, we remember that this is the story from which we have grown. In the retelling, we come to realize that it is our story too. And we are called to be agents of continuing the story. That we too can become God's partners in freeing the oppressed and walking with those who suffer. And then God rescues us too, setting us free from the slavery of fear or greed or hopelessness or depression or anxiety or a whole host of other things that oppress us. And so we are all both those who are set free and those who are called to free our neighbors. Ours is the story where we are all freed from what binds us and called to bring about God's kingdom. This is the story of our faith, and we must continue to tell it. And we will tell it until all are free, all are fed, and all are one. May it be so. Amen.